Nigeria's government has been facing a financial crunch at the federal and state levels for some years, with declining all revenues further worsened by the COVID-19 pandemic. In order to cope with the fiscal crisis, the federal government has been taking more loans at ever-increasing premiums, which have raised the country's debt profile. It also increased the value-added tax VAT from 5% to 7.5% in 2020. The increase in VAT enabled it to raise 651.77 billion naira as VAT in the first half of 2020. This was an 8.45% increase when compared with the first half of 2019. This was very significant considering that the government had anticipated a budget deficit of 2.18 trillion naira. About $6 billion for the 2020 budget before the pandemic set in. However, the federal government could stand to lose up to half of this VAT revenue based on a recent judgment by the Federal High Court in Port Harcourt, Rivers State. The court ruled that states can collect VAT within their boundaries. This is a ruling that would leave the federal government with only VAT within the Federal Capital Territory, non-import foreign VAT, and import VAT on international trade through the Nigeria Customs Service. In many ways, it can be said that the judgment was coming, as the legal status of VAT in terms of which tier of government was empowered to collect it has always been a gray area. Since its introduction in 1993 by the military regime of General Ibrahim Babangida, VAT, which replaced sales tax, has been collected by the Federal Inland Revenue Service (FIRS) and then shared among Nigeria's three tiers of government: federal, state, and local governments. This was unlike the previous sales tax that was administered by the states. This was not an issue under the command structure of the military regimes. However, Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999 emboldened some states to challenge the rights of the federal government to collect VAT. Since sales tax and VAT are essentially the same thing, except that sales tax is paid only when a final sale of the product or service has been made, while VAT is paid at every stage of the supply chain. Attempts to achieve a political solution have failed, while in 2014 a suit filed by the Lagos state government with regards to VAT was thrown out by the Supreme Court on a technicality. Now, the Rivers State government has successfully challenged the powers of the federal government to collect VAT. It is expected that the judgment will be challenged all the way to the Supreme Court, whose judicial pronouncements will provide clarity on the matter. So who will be the biggest gainers and losers if the Federal High Court judgment holds all the way? Contrary to popular belief, the federal government will not be among the biggest losers. Although it is losing on VAT that will now be collected by states, the share of VAT that will still accrue to it will be large. In 2020, total VAT collection was 1.53 trillion naira, with import VAT comprising 348 billion naira, foreign non-import VAT was 420 billion naira, and local VAT was 763 billion naira. Considering that the current formula for sharing VAT gives 15% to Abuja, 50% to the states, and 35% to the local government councils, with 4% allocated to the FIRS as the cost of collection, the new arrangement will mean that the federal government will keep all of import and foreign non-import VAT, a cumulative sum of 768 billion naira last year. It will also gain more in VAT if VAT on federal contracts, which is currently included in local VAT, is excised, as that will now solely go to the federal government. This means that the states will have less VAT to collect. In addition, due to a previous Supreme Court decision that ruled that VAT covers all consumption taxes in Nigeria, states cannot impose a consumption tax in addition to VAT. It also means that any state intending to collect VAT must repeal any existing consumption taxes. Examples of states that have consumption taxes include Lagos and Kano states. So which states then gain the most from this new direction? Without doubt, Lagos State is the biggest beneficiary, as it generated as much as 418 billion naira in revenue in 2020, a whopping 140% of what it received in federal allocations in the same year. Rivers State, which generated 59% of its federal allocation internally, or 117 billion naira, comes a distant second. It is then closely followed by Ogun and Kaduna states. However, the other 32 states all generated less than 30% of their federal allocations as internal revenue, with half of the states generating less than 20%. At the opposite end, states like Bayelsa, Jigawa, Katsina, and Adamawa are almost entirely dependent on federal allocations, as they are able to generate only 8% of what they received last year as internal revenue. Nonetheless, it is important to point out the significance of this judgment. First, it highlights the fact that Nigeria is restructuring, as its constituent parts are renegotiating the structure of the federation. This is getting accelerated by fiscal conditions that have made states more dependent on the center amidst worsening economic conditions and increased responsibilities, such as a new minimum wage that increases their wage bill. The VAT suit brought by the Rivers State government has already set a precedent for states to challenge the powers of the federal government over revenue collection, where the Constitution is not explicitly clear that those powers belong to the federal government. Already, all 36 states have united in challenging the powers of the federal government to collect, administer, or keep the proceeds of any stamp duties on transactions involving individuals within the respective states. It is also asking for stamp duty funds generated from the states between 2015 and 2020, which it says amounts to 176 billion naira. While this is a relatively small amount in the overall pie of the federal government's revenues, it is nonetheless significant for the states, especially those with poor revenue-generating capacities at the moment. It can be expected that these battles between federal and state rights will continue, and it will further accelerate Nigeria's restructuring. It is now up to policymakers to work towards a negotiated and orderly decentralization rather than in which the federating units bite away at the edges until the structure chaotically collapses. Secondly, the judgment will require Nigerian government at all levels to adopt a more serious and business-like approach to taxation. At present, Nigeria's tax-to-GDP ratio is 6.5%, way below the African average of 16.5%, which itself is lower than the Latin America and the Caribbean average of 23.1%. This is especially so for states whose approach to taxation has been the arbitrary imposition of levies on various entities in order to force them to the negotiating table. This will mean that state tax authorities will have to improve their tax collection capacity in order to be able to effectively collect VAT within their domains. Thirdly, the collection of VAT by states will also provide opportunities for the financial independence of local governments. The Rivers State VAT law provides that 30% of the VAT collected should accrue to the local government area where the product or service is consumed, while that of Lagos State prescribes 25% to the local government areas. However, there is already some opposition to this in Lagos State by its 57 local government and local council development areas who are asking for equal sharing of the VAT collected in their domains. The increased revenue to the local governments will give them more autonomy from the state government, as well as more funds to execute projects. Last but not least, the collection of VAT by states and local governments will increase accountability, as they will be forced to be accountable to taxpayers. This is lacking under the status quo, with all receipts and VAT proceeds from the center. This will lead to improved governance at all levels. So where do we go from here? The recent ruling of the Court of Appeal asking the parties to maintain the status quo until the appeal of the Federal High Court judgment is determined gives the federal government some room to continue collecting VAT across the country. Considering the outsized constitutional implication of the matter, we can expect that the case will receive expedited hearing all the way to the Supreme Court. However, the battle line has been drawn. The appetite of states to push for fiscal autonomy will only continue to grow, and the collective fiscal trauma has helped to blur party and ideological lines in this push. Already, Rivers State has gotten support for its lawsuit from northern states like Adamawa and southern states like Akwa Ibom. There is the possibility that these states will join the lawsuit as challengers to the powers of the federal government to collect VAT. No matter the final judgment on this issue, Nigeria's structure, fiscally and politically speaking, will unlikely remain the same.